very important to us. So here you can see how we decompose those two oxygen concentration parameter into a property, which would be concentration. It could be something else. This is just a subjective choice, really, but it's a broad concept, concentration, that enables us to deal with that example. And then we've got the object of interest, which is oxygen. Oxygen can be found in chemical specific terminology like KB. So we can reference them to any kind of authoritative terminologies. Then you've got the matrix in that case, which is a water body. And we've also got a constraint which specifies that this the oxygen was dissolved in the water. So this is a way, this is one way of decomposing those variables. This is another example, but this is just to show how it's been implemented in the NERV vocab server. We've actually created a special profile for the IADOPT expression of any terminologies that might require to be decomposed according to IADOPT in the NERV vocab server. And we've created properties here like that matches the IADOPT properties as matrix, as object of interest, as property. And this is a way it can then be used by SPARQL queries, by reasoners, to obtain the information from the NERV vocab server. As well as the ontology, we came up with some general recommendation for the description of variables. So those should be human and machine readable. They should be explicit and sufficient for understanding what is being measured. They should use semantic artifacts. So just having free text or even reusing vocabularies that has been published in a scientific publication is not sufficient. They should really be accessible by machine through UIs or PI or persistent identifiers. If possible, it would be, we recommend obviously to use the IADOPT ontology because it is a very simple common framework that could easily be adopted by many domains. And also to reuse any terminologies that have already been aligned to IADOPT. The latest version of the ontology, we had one update, which was to add a new class, which was a variable set. And this was to enable us to address the aggregation use case for the creation of products, like, for example, the essential climate variable products or the essential ocean variable products, but also to enable the use of parameter to facilitate discovery of those complex variables as well. So this is the latest version. So here, just very quickly, just to give you some an idea of what we're currently working on, because we want to demonstrate interoperability. We want to say that, okay, we've come up with that ontology, but it's not just a theory. We actually developed this to use it in the real world. So we're going to test a number of use case scenarios in the coming few months. So the first one is if you've got a variable from a variable in a data set that comes from a given terminology with a URI, and it's been mapped using IADOPT to a series of atomic elements like concentration, ammonium, water bodies, or water body. And you've got another terminology that has been from another data set that has been annotated using, and you've got another variable from another data set annotated with another, with terms from another terminology, but it's also been mapped using IADOPT concepts, and we want to use this. We want to use this use case scenario to show that we can then use SPARQL queries to match the data set, so the actual data that are associated with it. And we've already demonstrated that in some pilot project at BODC using the NVS, that it's possible to do this and to have some very efficient results. So the other use case was more complex. It's actually, you've got, again, two variables from two different data sets, from using a concept from two different terminologies, but they've both been mapped using IADOPT, but they might not have been mapped to the same common concepts. But in that case, if those concepts are actually linked using linked data and they have relationship between them, then it's possible to use a reasoner to also create some interoperability between the two. But we need to test that in real case, in real life. So that's our second challenge. And the third one is we have a data set annotated with control vocabularies from a terminology, but the other data set is not. It's just got free text variable headers, but somebody has actually linked those variables to IADOPT atomic concepts without creating a complex variable. And again, we want to test interoperability in that situation as well. So I think this is my last slide. And basically, this is, we want to carry on developing tools on the top of this and carry on testing the framework, testing the ontology, and taking feedback from people. So thank you very much. If you have any question, I should have said that I could have taken questions in the middle, but it might have been difficult being online.
Thank you, Gwen. Does anybody have any questions for her? No?
We have a question online.
Oh, there. Okay. So we'll go online first. Yeah. Okay. So there's one online. Perfect. Go for it.
Yes, so thanks for the presentation. It's very interesting. I had a question because so I've been looking at this IADOPT mapping in your vocabulary for some time, but there aren't that many variables that are decomposed using IADOPT, and I was wondering if you can say a little bit more about the governance. So how is the process of doing this decomposition? Is there some sort of committee, or is there some sort of steps that someone can suggest and then it's approved, or things like that?
Very good question, Lara. Yeah, so at the moment, the mappings we've done have been done in the framework of pilot projects. So we are still trying to find the best way to map. So there is a discussion ongoing at the moment whether whether we should all try to map to a selection of reference vocabularies, but many of them are ontologies, and the concept we're interested in mapping to are actually ontological classes, and there seems to be an issue about that. So we need to resolve that, and once that is done, then we should start mapping systematically P01 and P07. But you're correct that at this stage, we only focused on a few variables that were related to the pilot cases we were working on.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, great. I think we have one question in the room, so go for it, Jonathan.
Hi, Gwen. It's Jonathan.
Hi, John.
You might need to bend this example a little bit, but how would IADOPT handle more specific instances of variable? And so I'm gonna bend this by saying, pretend that the variable is blue, and then you have navy blue. So they're both blue in a sense, but one is a more specific example. I know they're variables, so I'm struggling to think of what the example is, but sort of overlapping things, but one is just one with greater detail than the other.
What was the second one?
So I was talking about blue and then navy blue. They're not really variables, but it's this sense of one is a more specific example of the other.
Maybe blue.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, it's a good question. I suppose, there are some subtleties that will be difficult to capture using a simple framework like IADOPT. I think in the CF standard names and in the BODC parameter usage vocabulary, we can use, I mean, especially in the BODC parameter usage vocabulary, I think we have a semantic model that enables us to actually be specific, even if it has to be very specific, so that we don't, we are able to describe very exactly what was measured, especially if we don't want users to think that it is the same thing as the thing that is a little bit broader. It's always a very fine line, you know, how much, you know, how much can you capture? And it is subjective, you know, it is subjective. But in your case of blue or maybe blue, I think I would, okay, maybe it could be a quality flag, uncertainty, you know, so the color is uncertain. So you could actually, you know, say that it should really be dealt with as part of a quality flag or a quality scheme. But if you were to put it into the description of the variable, then it would be potentially possible. I mean, when we do parameter code for description of plankton, for example, where there's a lot of descriptions that are quite specific because people were unable to actually identify exactly what was there, and they might have described what they saw. So according to the color, the shape, and we do capture that in our parameter usage vocabulary. So it just depends on the terminology managers, what they want to do. But with regards to the IADOPT, then that's something slightly different. IADOPT in that case, you know, and IADOPT will never replace that kind of terminology. I think it would be used to bridge between terminology, and it can be used for people who want a simple model to describe their variable. But people who want some subtlety should really, you know, probably look at a different kind of terminology and setup. But the recommendation is to align it to that IADOPT model, so that you know, even if a new terminology is created, it remains aligned, and we all remain aligned going forward.
Yeah, that's great. And I realize it was sort of a thorny question. It's just this broad question of equivalence in my head, because I know with programming, you can really, you know, you think something's equal and it's not quite, but you've answered it fine. So thank you.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Jonathan. But also, it's why we really want to test it in real use case scenario. You know, just to see what comes back.
Any other questions for Gwen? Oh, Petra, go for it.
Hi, Gwen. Petra is speaking.
Hi, Petra.
If I remember correctly, the IADOPT has been developed with environmental data in mind. The first use cases came from that area of science. I was wondering whether you could say maybe a few words about applicability of IADOPT in other areas of science, whether there has been some pilots already done, and how that align in those areas of science.
Yes, was Barbara Magana, who was one of the co-chair and the lead of this group, really, or the driving force behind it. She's been involved in quite a lot of workshop and activities where they were looking at using IADOPT in the framework of social sciences, for example, or medical sciences. So all this is, you know, it's been, I mean, it's still in its infancy, but basically the model itself is applicable. Some people are interested in applying that model into their domain that is not environmental sciences, but there's still some little elements that needs to be, obviously the concept of metrics, for example, is very related to, I mean, it's not just environmental sciences, the metrics can also be in medical sciences. But, you know, there's this, we still need to have an agreement about how we use, you know, exactly how we use the model. Well, I think this is not surprising. This is not a standard. We haven't created a standard that, you know, say, okay, you need to use it that way. It is a framework supported by an ontology, but I think there will be a lot of human discussion about how best to use that framework. And I think undoubtedly there'll be situation when it might be quite difficult to apply it, but we need to test it.
Okay, thank you. So that seems there is still quite some work to do for the working group.
Absolutely, yes. Even just in environmental sciences, there's still a lot to because we need to connect it as well with other elements like the units of measure, like other ontology, higher level ontology. We need to show how all this can can connect with each other to build the bigger picture. So definitely, there's still a lot of work to do.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions online? No, we're good in person. Okay, I think that's a great segue. Thank you again, Gwen. Feel free to hang out and see. I was going to invite Oystein up to kind of give you a background on exactly what the polar semantics and vocabularies working group has been up to. But it sounds like we would really benefit from some cross-fertilization in between the iAdopt and stuff we've been up to too. So it'd be great to go from there. Go for it, Oystein. But thank you again, Gwen.
All right, thanks a lot.
I don't have any presentation, but I can give you some backdrop for the working group. Actually, we started this working group the fall of 2017, and initially we had quite frequent meetings every month, I think. It's sort of dropped a bit off in 2022 and 2023, and now we just want to have regular meetings so that we can move forward. The most interesting part, I think, is, as exemplified by the presentation here, there is a continuum for semantic work. And you have at one end the pure semantic experts, like out there with the framework, the ontology, and the governance structure of mappings and all these other things. And the real life challenge that we experience is that people are not using the controlled vocabularies. We have too many data sets that are documented using free text. So people invent their own sort of terminology in order to describe the data set. And then to integrate those data across the providers and the data centers, that's a challenge. So for the working group, what was presented here is part of the context for the working group, but also just raising the awareness of using those controlled vocabularies, thesaurus, taxonomies, whatever, to document the data. So not everyone can be a semantic expert, not everyone is building ontologies, but people should be aware of controlled vocabularies, glossaries, thesaurus, taxonomies, etc., that we could use in our day-to-day work. And if people start to work and use with those, it will actually simplify the process of integrating data across the providers and the data center. So I think that continuum is within the scope of the working group. And we've had a lot of very dedicated, what I would call more or less semantic discussions along the lines here, not necessarily on the building frameworks, but at least on crosswalks, getting overview of which vocabularies are already existing and are used in the community. I would say that the focus is now to get people to use it. We need to look into mapping, and we need to involve a larger community in the mapping. You need the guidance of semantic experts when you set up the mappings, but also lessons learned is that if you do not involve scientists and the science community in those mappings, they won't accept that there is a mapping that is actually valid. This was at least one of the lessons learned I had when I worked with generating vocabularies within WMO. And also when I've been trying to promote reuse of whether it's CF standard names or GCMB science keywords or anything else, you need some sort of traction in the science community as well. But at least that gives you some of the backdrop of the working group. So it's not on one end or the other end, it's in between. But I think that we really need an effort in order to have more data centers enforcing application of standardized vocabularies and glossaries in their data documentation. I think that's at least the backdrop. It's a bit floating now, but it's up to us to sort of create the path forward on this. And of course, also this is my perspective, but Rebecca, you've been in this almost as long as me.
Well, I have the same perspective. Yeah, actually, I'll kind of back up a little bit and just talk about something that occurred to me. So it was interesting that Jonathan brought up the example of the color blue, because in Russian, there are two separate words. There's not one word for blue, and you don't modify it based on what kind of blue it is. They're actually two completely separate words. One of them means light blue, and one of them is like, I don't know, blue, not navy, just it's different. But this is something that semantics and linguistics as a whole is constantly throwing around, is the idea of what's universal. What is the bare minimum? What is the least common denominator? How much of that is cross-cultural in the case of what I work with? I mean, and really it's exactly the same problem. And I think that there are some good tools and some good examples out there of how to approach this. I think one of the things that we need to be very careful about is what is universal. And this is kind of why I harp on and on and on about what I harp on about, right? It's just because you think that it's not data does not mean that it's not data. So for me, the biggest thing is getting people to try and think outside of their own boxes, because I'm not sure that we're all even collectively at the point where we can say what that least common denominator is. And I think the way to do it is to say what actually is everybody using, and have that as like, you know, the basis of everything, and then begin to modify based on that. That's certainly what we've done with CCADI in terms of metadata. And you know, Shannon brought up how crosswalking to Mark 21 was really, really difficult because it's two separate worlds. But if we can kind of get down to the very, very basics, and if we have everybody collectively thinking at that level of saying, what is everybody else also going to find useful, as difficult as that may be, I think that it makes all of our jobs collectively easier. So I think that I like the I adopt approach. But we will inevitably run into these problems of translation because that is the nature of humanity. And I think it's just a matter of working through all of these problems, but thinking not in terms of, for example, the polar data community, but in terms of, you know, everything, in terms of trying to figure out these different kind of levels of use. Don't know if that makes any sense. Don't know if anybody agrees with me. This is just from my own perspective, having done the semantics, the technical semantics, but then also having worked on semantics at the linguistic level.
So one thing that I would like to dwell a bit with is whenever people document data, my sort of observation is that people document for themselves. But when we publish data, we want other people to actually use the data. So we shouldn't document for ourselves, we should document for someone else, not having the context that we have. And that's what makes me, so there's a lot of data centers represented in this room. So what are the perspectives of those data centers at the documentation? So what is your guidance for the scientists or whoever, the data providers that are giving you data? Do you have this perspective? Also, we heard something about titles, I think, earlier today, also having descriptive titles of the data sets. But also then, how do we tell the content of the data, or the variables in the data set, etc.? Do you have any guidance on that? Do you enforce anything on that? And or do you sort of let everything open? Do you have your own sort of vocabularies that you're using? And are those available in a sort of technology that can be reused in this context? So we can start building these translations. It's quite a lot of questions, but because I'm eager to understand how the various data centers are operating in here, because we need to understand that to be able to bridge between them.
So I am not what you are in terms of your knowledge base. Like, I don't even understand what metadata is. I'm going to be really honest, but I need Rebecca. I need her, and I need Mia really to do the work that I want to do. So I do health systems research. So and I'm here to learn, which is really painful, to be honest, as well. When I think about the words that I would use to put on a map, my solution is to make my own vocabulary, because I don't trust any of you. And the reason I don't trust any of you is that you're all working within a framework that is grounded in largely white supremacy and a particular kind of white Christian supremacy that is infiltrating the academy and all the data that's used to describe Indigenous peoples. And so I'm stuck, and I'm stuck with English, and I'm stuck with what exists. And there's so many Indigenous researchers, health researchers in Canada who are desperately trying to understand healthcare systems, and so don't engage with mapping, and don't engage, and also our data, the bits and pieces of Indigenous people, that it's so fragmented and manipulated against Indigenous people that we are constantly being examined under this Western biomedical model that is underscored by racism within the healthcare system, to the point that Indigenous people won't even get healthcare. So I'm stuck, and this is why I need Rebecca and Mia. I'm sorry I haven't asked you, Mia, but I know that Rebecca is a settler and engages in that in a really respectful manner. But she is one of the only people who does this work, and Peter, actually, by way of example, who I would trust enough to work with us on this extremely sensitive data. And I don't even know if I'm using the word data right, to be honest, information. So, but I think that's, so I'm making this whole new vocabulary, doesn't match anything else. I don't know if I should care at this point. I don't, but there's this little part of me that says maybe I should, but I don't know.
It does, but I think that's ultimately, that's one of our goals. Ultimately, one of the goals is, and that kind of goes back to what I've, again, been talking about, is like, at what point do we all find these commonalities? And I think if we're not bringing people in from those other, that's not the right terminology. If we're not bringing in a huge group of people, and yes, I know it's hard, and I know that it's painful, but if we're not getting those voices, then we're not doing our jobs. If we're not understanding that those are problems, we are not doing the job. So, you know, I mean, I think that it's good to question that. It's good to say, is this inclusive of people whose voices traditionally have not been at the table? And if not, how do we find that out? So, you know, Oystein's asking about, well, what does your data center look like? I think we all need to be asking, what does this other type of data over here look like? Who should I ask? How do I understand this? Somebody had their hand up and I interrupted.
You've got two questions. Did want to just highlight real quick with the working group. There, one of our recent initiatives was to put out this call to the community saying that, hey, we're approachable. You have these questions, come hang out, and let's talk about it. So just wanted to highlight that. Sorry, I did see Alice and then Shannon. Yeah.
So it's a question online.
Oh, it's a question. Okay. Go for it.
From Vanessa.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome, Vanessa.
Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Awesome. I think this is a great conversation, and I just wanted to jump in. I really appreciate that explanation of the iAdopt framework, and I also appreciate the comments from the room. I think this is actually a group that is working to bridge that gap and draw data processes closer to Indigenous knowledge frameworks. And we're not there yet. And I think we all acknowledge that we're really quite far away from these two or multiple different perspectives sort of playing nice together. I think the iAdopt framework is a nice way to think about interoperability. And it's really cool that you're creating those codes that, you know, I have seen also in maps. I don't know if you guys have seen the 3 words. I think it's like 3words.com, but basically any place on Earth is described with a combination of 3 words, 3 short words. And I think there's actually a lot of people thinking about mapping and health and data sovereignty and self-determination in very meaningful ways. And I think also in the Arctic data space. And so I think our job is to highlight those voices so that people don't feel alone and lost and frustrated because this is the work that a lot of people have been doing for the past at least decade, if not 3 decades. And then one thing I wanted to say is that, and I was mainly focusing on the iAdopt framework, so I'm just talking about that, you know, that's about interoperability, which in a lot of cases in Indigenous data sovereignty concerns is not about interoperability because that goes against Indigenous knowledge frameworks, right? We're not taking things away, abstracting them and mixing them with other things. Like that's not the way that those types of worldviews operate, and they don't operate outside of context. And so it makes sense to me that it feels like a very foreign concept because it is, right? It's the antithesis of how many like holistic worldviews are. And so anyways, I just wanted to share my thoughts and thank all of the speakers. And I don't know who is speaking in the room. So if you guys wouldn't mind saying your names, it helps. But I think this is a wonderful conversation and I think it's a very important topic.
Thanks, Vanessa. Shannon, go for it.
Okay, so I'm Shannon Christofferson in the interest of introducing myself. And I'm going to talk wearing a different hat than I did presenting today, and that's my hat as a vice lead for the University of the Arctic's thematic network on decolonization of Arctic library and archives metadata, or DALM. All these titles are far too long. So just to follow on to what Karen and Rebecca were recently saying, one of the issues with metadata and vocabularies isn't just, and this is reiterating what Karen said, isn't just that they lack Indigenous terminologies and structures and things. It's the fact that they have colonialist structures and they have colonialist language. And as somebody that is a settler myself, I can't see it. I can try. And occasionally I can spot it, and occasionally I can have it pointed out to me, but it isn't always easy to see how that language is structured in very specific ways. It's a little bit, and I don't mean this in a way that's deliberate, but it's insidious. It's not that it's meant to be that way, it's just, it's grown that way. And because of that, it could make it really difficult to do this kind of work. And that's why when Karen explains that she doesn't trust any of us, I'm not offended. It's not really meant offensively. That's how the structure is and how it's been created. And so it can be just what I wanted to say in response to Rebecca is that I agree that it's important to do this work, but one of the reasons that you didn't list is that it's important to do this work because otherwise we're perpetuating. And we're actually in a phase, particularly, and I don't know if it's particularly, but I notice it a lot in Canada right now because we're in a phase of reconciliation. But it's more noticeable. Do you know what I mean? If we don't want to perpetuate it because we're actively trying to not do that right now. I understand reconciliation is.
You have to use scare quotes around it.
But yeah, you know what I mean?
I
Like,
do,
that's the term, but, and I understand why you laugh, but at the same time, whether we giggle at it or not, it's important that we keep trying to move forward.
Well, so, I'm sorry, it's Rebecca again. That to me is the reason that we shouldn't be working alone.
Well, yes,
Because
exactly, because I can't see
there's
it.
no-
We can-
right.
Nobody can see it.
so despite having worked within specific communities for as long as I have, despite being partially integrated into those communities, not completely and never fully, and you know, would never call myself Indigenous, etc. I have a pretty good background in a lot of that stuff. I go to ceremony. My family is Haudenosaunee. I don't know, and that's fine. And I don't expect to know. But that also means that I'm not doing anything without someone or really without the community. There's nothing that I do without the community. Even if it's just a little tiny question, I will find someone to ask. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying that we don't know. And I feel like people are afraid to say it, that they don't know. I feel like people are afraid to say, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how to do this. I don't necessarily have the understanding to do that. And I think we need to get better at it. One of my phrases that I say, and that I think I've already said here is, that's just my opinion. That's just what I think. This is just from my perspective. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that there needs to be room for us to be unsure about things. And I think the more that we're comfortable with being unsure of things, the more that people are going to come to us and say, I don't know how to do this either.
I think it's clearly sort of obvious now while we talk also, there's a range or a huge span in what we call data. We're talking data from instruments, so if it's a thermometer or something like that, all the way up to indigenous and local knowledge. Also not everyone in the world is speaking English either. It's not my native language either. I have to cope with the Norwegian language in quite a lot of context. And we will always lose something when we translate. And that's a fact, whether we like it or not. But I think that in this span of activities that we're working with, we have to start somewhere. there's a lot of problems, but if we only focus on the problems, then we won't get anywhere. But if we at least can start in one end and start nesting out of that, and then we will sooner or later, run into problems, especially if we want to really bridge between knowledge domains or so different types of data. And I think these are the discussions we also need in the working group. So can we identify some easy wins or at least starting points in order to sort of move along this path? And there is for sure a lot of problems that we are not able to solve. But let's sort of be aware of them and work on them on a longer term. I think that's at least part of the perspective I would like to have in this conversation. Some elements are easier to start with than other ones.
Sorry for Zoom people, it's Rebecca again. I think going back to your original question is a very good place to start. And I'm here because I am interested in hearing how people are doing things. It was a reason that I was at the first 2 days with icebreaker vessels. We're not gonna know if we don't ask. So particularly the conversation about who's using CF and who's using NERC, that's helpful, that's useful, right? How many of you have a standardized way of asking people to put their data in? Does anybody have standards when you ask people to put data in? We do, so CCADI does, so 1. You do. Does anybody else?
Sort of a loose framework.
Okay, more. And what are those standards?
For us,
What's yours? Are yours ours?
But then again, it depends, I would believe, on the data that you actually manage. So for us, sitting in the instrument world, more or less, working with WMO and exchange of information across the globe, for the specifics of oceanography, meteorology, etc., we are using CF, not CDF for the time being. And we can take other data, but then we need a good explanation.
So maybe the next question is, for those who aren't requiring standards, what's the thinking behind that? Is it just to encourage people to be adding their data, or is it just too hard to implement? Yeah, or is it that you want your own standards, or?
Stein, saw you throw it up.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to Øystein's original question and put in a comment from a slightly different perspective, because you mentioned this question about providing good title, good data set descriptions, exact descriptions of what exactly have been measured, etc. And sorry, I'm Stein Tronstad, Norwegian Polar Data Center. At our data center, we are publishing, a lot of what we publish is what I'd call experimental data sets. Data sets collected for a specific purpose, maybe to write just one scientific paper. And we have quite specific guidance on how to title the data set, how to describe the data set, what information you should provide. And yet we get a lot of very sloppy descriptions. Bad examples that we can put on the screen here. And I'm thinking that part of the reason for that is that data sets aren't really recognized as scientific products. There is no peer review. It's just a side activity. You've written your paper, you've gotten it published or reviewed, and then you are required to put your data out there. There are no specific requirements from the funders, from the publishers, or anyone else about quality of data sets. You don't get credit for publishing a high quality experimental data set. It's much easier with the long time series, the big volume data for, at least within the natural sciences, like standard transects or oceanography and that sort of stuff. But for the experimental data sets, it's very difficult to get high quality descriptions. So maybe that's that's a place where we should put in some effort with, I mean, outside of this little community of ours, to see what we can do to make sure that even experimental data sets gain recognition as scientific products.
I'm sorry, you had a question there, Shannon?
We actually am very similar. I'm Frank Nietzsche from USAP DC, so very similar to Stein. We don't get this large data sets like weather data or something that have very well defined standards. We get all kinds of, random. I mean, we take basically very broadly what data can be defined. We have also reports, logbooks, I don't know, whatever people want to think has value to be preserved somehow digitally. And that's why we have usually, we have some our own kind of standards, like titles we would like accept, and if they think they're good or bad, but we have more like, allow them to have descriptions of how the data were created or produced or gathered, or is there any processing done, and some descriptive. We might want to go more in terms of, at least for some of them, more controlled vocabulary. That might be a good thing to go forward. Also, some fields, biology or some, they might not have their own standards, and finding out like, is a certain standard applicable to everything. Maybe if you go away at some point where we say, certain data types should follow certain standards if they're coming from a certain community. We don't know yet, but.
Shannon and then Jonathan?
I just wanted to follow on from what Stein said, because he and I have had this conversation before about funders and publishers and things like that. And I agree that there is such a strong emphasis on publications over the publishing of data. But I will say funders, at least in the United States through the NSF and in Canada, are starting to really require the publishing and making open of data as part of getting more funding. It's part of that requirement. What really concerns me more is I think universities need to put as much weight on making data part of getting tenure as much as publications, because it's always that publish, but it doesn't, in this day and age, it should be about publishing data as well as about publishing publications, because you can publish some really valuable data that doesn't necessarily translate into publications. Like sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but I think that really needs to be taken into consideration, and it's something that needs to be discussed at that university governance level.
Slow movement.
Oh, it's so slow.
I'll just go fairly quickly. This is Jonathan Cool with the Australian Antarctic Data Center, and we do conform to some standards like diff metadata, ISO, standards for GIS and whatnot. But we do rely on the scientists who do the fundamental collection to be providing us with the information. And I think what ends up happening is you have loss of information as you propagate through the chain, because the scientists will say, well, I don't know anything about your ISO standards. I'll just like, I've got to do media, and I've got to do publication, and I've got to do grant writing, and now you want me to know about all of these ISO standards and diff standards and vocabularies. I don't have enough time in the day. So on some level, they rely on us, and in particular Dave, to kind of mash it into what we know about data. But as I come back to, that's what they know, and we'll miss some of the things that they talk about, and we'll need some things that they won't talk about. So as it propagates through, you end up sort of losing those pieces of information. But a lot of it just comes down to they can't know everything, and we don't know everything that they need to know. But at the end of the day, we need to get it out.
Sorry, I saw Ria in the back. Just still got a question?
I just want to comment is that in South Africa in 2013 already, it was
if you're funded by the National Research Foundation, your data have to be open accessible. And these days, if you put a proposal in and in your annual reports, if you don't show exactly where your data is going, now I know it is not enforced that it's been done, but you know you're going to lose your grant. You're not going to back to you. So I don't want to spoil Anne's limelight because she's our knight in shining armor in getting SAPRI going for data management. So enforcing all those things will happen, but I think people got to realize in South Africa, and it unfortunately happened with the last cycle. People didn't get their grants because they don't have a data management plan in action. But totally agree with you, Jonathan, is that do they know the standards and do they know that and do they enforce it and do they know the metadata? But luckily we've got Anne now, so we don't worry about that anymore. I just find it on top of her, you know, always. Remember I brought you along, so. But just to say that there's certain definitely guidelines within South Africa that you've got to do it. I'm currently PI, and if I can't say what's happening to my data, what I do, what's my standard, it's all in my annual report. And I can just cut I'm not sure if I'm gonna have a new proposal, but in any case, the previous time I know I scored on that. So you've got to ensure if you want funds. And I think obviously South Africa is there maybe a step on par, and there is guidelines within, so in our, if you're sitting within our CSIR and within this department and that, and there's this huge document that states how your data must be done and so on. So it is great, but not everybody is doing it. But at least in our SANAP, our program, it's getting there. And I think it will be an ongoing whatever.
It's there, yeah, but it's not enforced.
Yeah,
So that's what we're trying to write into our policies.
yeah. But you know,
But
you're
it's
not going to get.
complicated because it's across different government departments and.
But you're not going to get funded. That's the bottom line in South Africa.
Like the authority, you know, like not getting.
It will happen.
I know you had a last point. I did want to just say, I know we want to get rolling to the dinner soon, so I encourage everybody to continue the conversation at dinner. And then, I mean, sounds like everybody has some great opinions, so you should be coming to the working group meetings and sharing this. But I will just say that and hand it off to Oystein.
I just wanted to continue a bit on the Spain and also Jonathan and a lot of people there. Some of the part of the problem as a credit, yes, I totally agree on that. That's why we need to show the benefit of actually publishing data for the country, and then we need to give credit back. But also that I want to go back to when you publish a data set, you never know the future use of the data set, even if it's an experimental data set. Also, I've had we published in our data center this summer, I think it was, or in the spring, experimental data set on experimental floaters in the drifters in the CS. But if you look back, you know, so in the polar regions, the monitoring you got is primarily the science community that does. And then you need to connect all the dots somehow. So if everything is so fragmented and heterogeneous, it's impossible to extract some information out of it. So even that data set, we got them to publish it as a CEF, NetCDF data set. It was a struggle, but, and it wasn't a perfect way of doing it, but it was good enough for the purpose. So it's reusable in the future. And I think that perspective of whenever scientists say that I don't find the data I need for my science, I can say you don't publish the data you need for your science. So you don't document it well enough. If you can't find it, other people can't find it either. So it's sort of help to self-service. And this is probably one of the best thing we can do is to show the benefit for the users, for the data providers. So who are using your data set? If you publish a common separated file, ESMWF won't use weather station. If you publish it in some sort of harmonized form, it will be picked up and it will actually affect the weather forecast, for example, in the area that you are. There can be other types of data as well. So this as a no answer, no solution to it, but I think as a these are the things that we need to work on. So it's not an argument for not documenting and not using standard controlled vocabularies, but it's actually an argument for doing it and doing it as well as possible. And with an experimental data sets, you have a publication based on it, and reproducible science means that someone will be able to pick up that data set and reproduce the results in that scientific paper. And that's also the perspective.
And you definitely do want to have some clear examples of what's in it for me. That's how they'll look at it. They'll say this is competing against all kinds of other time demands. What's in it for me? And they will come around, but you need to give them some confidence that it's worth their time.
Okay, is that an okay place to stop? I mean, if anybody is interested in writing, please do. I think you can get to the working group info through the ADC website, yes?
Yeah, and there is an email address. I published it on the, had it on the presentation I gave this morning, and there is a Slack channel.
Yes. So, bring your opinions.
Very cool. Thank you, Tucker.
We're more than handing it off.
No, but I'm not going to.
I have to hug you.
So where